All right, GM Pinto Farm. Freeho and I, had a few things we wanted to talk about temperature-wise and open for Q&A. We have a small crew today, but I know that Sage of the Silos had a question I wanted to kick us off with. So take it away.
Sorry, which question were you referring to?
Either, either or. You were referencing the temperature chart and how it leveled off at one point and now it's turning around. I figure we
Yes.
can start there.
So I've noticed that generally the chart just kind of goes up and to the right. We've only had increases in temperature. There is perhaps a small area where the slope decreases, which seems to coincide with one of the soil changes. And in the last couple of seasons, let's say 12 hours, it seems like we've actually had a rounding off and a decrease in the temperature for the first time, at least a significant decrease. And I was wondering what, caused that.
Good question. From my perspective, the fact that on April 18th we shipped PI8, which included this change that adds a new threshold for pod rate, called the extremely high pod rate level, which is the state the system is in anytime the pod rate is above 100%. The pod rate is currently 298.5%, it looks like. If you, I'll just link in the town hall chat if you want to open the graphic, which shows the new maximum temperature changes, which are highlighted in orange. I'll also just post a screenshot of that here in this chat, uh, which felt like a pretty big change to me. Which is that basically in the bottom right, not quadrant, but section, uh, of this table, where it's the price is less than one and the debt level is extremely high. Now, for the first time, when in that state, when demand for soil is increasing, we decrease the maximum temp by a whole 1%. And when demand is decreasing, we slowed down the increase from 1 to 0.5%. And I mean, as I see it, the combination of that, plus the extremely small soil amounts, which was shipped in PI6, I think about 6 or 7 weeks ago, uh, I would say that that is mostly responsible for the now level off in temperature and the fact that it started to decrease.
I see. So actually it's kind of like 2x. Um, if we're in increasing soil, we're losing a percent per season, whereas in a decreasing, we're only gaining zero point 0.5. So, it actually looks like we would be trending down in general if there's demand at least once every other season. Is that correct?
Exactly. Um, this is actually sort of one problem I foresee. It's sort of unclear exactly how to mitigate this type of manipulation, but it does seem like, and by the way, in PI8, there's now a new minimum amount of Pinto that need to be sown in order for demand to be anything but, and demand for soil to be considered anything but decreasing, and that threshold is set to 25. And currently there was no minimum threshold, so you could just sow a micro Pinto. But now you can sow, let's say the system, you're the only person sowing, and what happens is you sow 25 one season, 0 the next season, 25 the next season, et cetera, alternating between 25 and 0, uh, such that, demand is increasing one season, decreasing the next, and increasing, decreasing, and so on. As you would point out, now in that state, the temperature would decrease. And so it would only take, 25 times 12 pinto per day, which is 300 pinto per day, to make the temperature decrease. Uh, and it's not totally clear to what extent that is or is not a problem or a good thing. I think the verdict is still out.
In the same vein, if you were to sow 25, then 25.01, 25.02, 25.03, could you actually force the 1% over and over?
Yes, there's a little bit more to it. You'd have to sow more than 25.01. Freeho, correct me if I'm wrong, but
Is there like a
basically
5%?
assume yes, there's a it's that um like it's that delta demand like levels of like 0 to 95% where it's decreasing, 95 to 105% where it's steady, and 105% plus where it's increasing. Where what I mean by 105% is basically the amount of Pinto sown last season divided by the amount of Pinto sown before the season before that. So you need 5% more sown each season. And yeah, so that would be, you'd have to sow a little bit more each time in order to continue to make demand increasing in consecutive seasons.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like these are two different things where like, we have to determine some threshold in which demand is increasing, but we also have to, figure out some way to measure the accuracy of that demand being, increasing, right? You know, Personally, I feel like there's an argument to be made to widen that gap of maybe, let's say 2030, but I feel like determining a minimum,
The gap being the steady gap,
yeah, for sure.
like the 95 to 105%, like making that range bigger.
Yes.
Got it.
And that would circumvent this issue of the ability to manipulate the temperature to some degree. But I don't think that completely solves it. I think it's more of a byproduct. Like, but the real issue is that it's very hard to determine or create some mechanism in which it can't be manipulated. It being the demand for soil uh, to be very manipulation resistant, just due to the transparent nature of the rules, right? Uh, maybe one
Yeah,
suggestion is to have like the minimum increase over periods of increasing demand and have that increase be higher than the change in the delta demand. So for instance, if the upper bound increase is 5%, or sorry, in other words, demand had or the amount of soil sown this season has to be 5% more than last season for demand to be increasing. Perhaps you increase the minimum by 15% over the course of multiple increasing demand seasons, uh, such that the compounding rate is much faster and thus uh, creates less or creates a higher cost of manipulation.
So if I understood that, when you say the minimum, you're talking about the threshold for demand to be measured, right? You're talking about increasing that.
Yeah, I mean you have to find some minimum in which one it's relative to supply, uh, and two takes an account to the fact that it could be potentially manipulated, if that makes sense. Like it needs to know somehow whether if like if the system knows it's being manipulated and adjusting its minimum parameters based on that. But that's very hard to do in practice.
Just so I understand, what is the fear of the manipulation? Is it that somebody could dump the temperature to zero despite not really affecting the price at all, and therefore reducing any incentive for people to sow?
Exactly. Especially before this minimum existed, it would take basically zero capital to drive the temp down to zero, which, I mean, it's not like it's only, of course, it's not manipulation in the sense of, there's funds at risk or anything like that. It just means that, uh, I mean, especially in the case where there was no minimum and it only cost less than a Pinto to do this manipulation, you could make it such that the incentive to lend or sow is erased entirely. Yeah, I mean, to me, it sort of comes down to the fact that no one knows what the temperature should be. And so the hope is to have designed a system that inches its way closer to whatever it should be, in spite of not knowing what it is. It being the optimal temperature at a given point in time. And so if it is artificially decreasing, when in fact, the market believes that the optimal temperature is higher than what it currently is, then that would be problematic.
One
Yeah,
caveat to this is that you would require a single person sowing, right? Like you have to not have anybody else be able to manipulate it with you.
Yeah, this only occurs when there, Pinto's in a state where there is no demand for sewing at all. And thus, like this one marginal user has the ability to make a non-marginal change. Uh, but when they're, like right now, when soil is sold out every season, you know, then yeah, it's impossible to manipulate it beyond increasing.
Right.
It's
There
the
as in there
periods in, I mean, it's the periods where, I'm sorry for interrupting. It's a period when nobody is sowing that uh, price discovery for temperature occurs, you could argue that that's like the most important point or time for temperature to find its ideal temperature, or the protocol to find its ideal temperature.
But if there's at least a couple of people actively watching, then the second somebody tries to manipulate it that way and they see the temperature freeze or start to decrease despite the small amount sown, you'd imagine that there would be a little bit of FOMO, right? People were waiting for a higher temperature to cash in. And then now that the temperature starts to decrease, they would say, oh, well, I have to put it in now. Otherwise it's going to start decreasing and I won't get as much return, right?
I
Totally.
definitely agree with that. And I think that yeah, the FOMO component you allude to is definitely the strongest counter argument uh against, the fact that it could be manipulated. I think it's sort of just a function of what the cost to the manipulation is. And when there was no minimum, it wouldn't, it costs basically nothing to manipulate the temp down. At least with some minimum threshold, you sort of do have to, spend a little bit of money and decide whether those pods that you're sowing are going to be worth anything in the future. And in general, even, with this tractor launch that just went live today, and I assume there's going to be more sowing, I am pretty interested to see whether, as the temp decreases, if the temp decreases, of course, from something like 1400 where it's at to something like 1200, if that induces any additional sewing, I think that will be very interesting to see. Um, but the short answer is I totally agree with what you're saying. That very well could happen.
But I agree that some level of a minimum, at least so somebody's not doing it for literally free. You could argue that 300 Pinto a day isn't significant to capital either, but it is, I mean, it means you have to have some level of capital. You can't just buy one Pinto and then just do these microtransactions, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Yeah, I
you can
So
mean,
also
real
make the argument that like someone who's investing this much, time and effort into Pinto, it's in their best interest to see Pinto succeed. Like this is like a DOS vector where they can manipulate the price or temperature down, right? But if they have so much exposure to the Pinto ecosystem, then there's an economic incentive not for you to act in this way as well.
I would think the economic incentive would be like you're trying to crush competition or something, right? You have a competing, like this is just a pure malicious actor in my mind. This wouldn't be somebody that's trying to participate in the system and actually have it, benefit them. It would be just like trying to dump it to zero or make the experiment fail in a way due to just malicious intent, just trying to mess with it, right?
Agreed.
So earlier we alluded to nobody really knows what the ideal temperature is. I wonder, you know, if there have at least been any thoughts around it because anybody coming in here seeing a potential 15x return on their investment, that's almost like a too good to be true alarm bells kind of go off sort of thing. Like this, there's no way this could be legit, right? And then if you look at Beanstalk's runaway temperature to like 30,000%, right? Is there any worry that um, a temperature too high is almost doing the opposite of the intent, which would be to incentivize sowing, but it actually makes people think, oh, well, this will never pay out. This is, far too good to be true.
I mean, I feel like almost certainly that's the case. It's just in a similar way, who knows what that number is?
Would you assume it
Like if
should
there, if
be like if you think about, traditional finance, which maybe is already a bit of a fallacy, but even like 50% temperature to me seems like it would be a pretty good ROI compared to traditional investments if it was, somewhat consistent.
I mean, to me, the current temperature is a reflection of the risk, and existing TradFi instruments do not generally have the level of risk of something like Pinto, and thus are able to successfully offer lower interest rates, akin to your example. Like this is a new currency in the earliest possible stage. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's not like there's many historical examples to compare it to in that sense.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
think like
you know,
if yeah, I feel like you can make that argument for a lower temperature. For like higher supplies, obviously when Pinto's at billions, a very high temperature like this can be seen as unsustainable. But to Austin's point, you know, this is the very early days of a new currency. You know, the system has yet to experience another credit cycle at this moment. There's no data. Uh, so from my perspective, like the risk that the user is taking is so high that I can totally see this to be a reasonable temperature, especially compared to other. I mean, we're competing against. I mean, the protocol is competing against other ventures with different risk and reward. Yeah, I mean, temperature has to be pretty attractive in that regard to attract capital from those people. But I mean, runaway temperature is a commentary on like the rate in which it changes rather than the position itself. Well, I guess it is a commentary on the position, but and the rate in which it changes is definitely a different and bigger question on how it should change, based off its state, and should it change more aggressively in the other direction? Now that we recently just added this new threshold where it's being much more aggressive to more tune the temperature. This is a very interesting data point, right? This is like something we've never seen before in the lifetime of Pinto, where even though Pinto is below its value target, it still wants to optimize on temperature.
So with the current changes with Tractor and the new thresholds, we expect, I suppose, to see temperatures drop, but are there any like hypotheses, or is it really just a wait and see across 1 or 2 weeks what happens?
On this end, I guess I'm curious. It's so hard to make a hypothesis because then you would have to understand what the general market wants as a temperature. I think one person commented that the most of the Tinto zone in the pod line right now was sown in like the 30 mil or the 30% range. You know, but that's at a way different pod line than we have right now. Uh, so it really is anybody's guess on what the ideal temperature is, right? We see the trend line going down. I suspect with the current tractor orders, you know the temperature will come to a more downward slope. But yeah, I mean, I expect once the temperature reaches a value that isn't as attractive, less orders will occur, and then it'll slowly rise up. But yeah, I guess we're just more curious at this point what that value is.
For me, it is my hypothesis that the temp will probably go down in the near term, if not solely because the amount of soil is so small, or the amount of available soil is so small, and we just launched Tractor, and I anticipate, people to experiment with that. Um, yeah, so I mean, at minimum, I would anticipate it decreasing in the short term, and think that this is sort of related to the manipulation discussion of earlier. I mean, it's a small concern that basically the temp goes down for a bit because people are using Tractor and experimenting with it, and then is much lower than where it should be after that point in time when that demand, if and when that demand dries up, and now with this change in PI8 where the temperature increases slower, it'll take that much longer to get back to a point where it's attractive again. Um, but who knows? That may just be FUD.
I mean, for me personally, like the time between DI8, which or PI6, sorry, I forget how long that was. You said 6 or 7 weeks, and the time for tractor. For me, the inability for people to just, and even before that, I think halfway through we added withdrawal and sell. The friction is just so high. that I feel like a lot of seasons where soil didn't set out was not because of the temperature, but just because it was just so high friction. Uh, tells me that the temperature is higher than it would have been had tractor been launched at the same time. So yeah, my concern isn't as high as Austin's. Is I guess what I'm saying.
And of course, if the tractor experimentation leads to some sort of snowball effect, then my whole point is moot. Snowball effect meaning like it ends up resulting in some sort of additional demand for sowing.
I could definitely see a snowball effect. Like prior to, I think PI6, PI7, I'm also getting him confused. Somebody could just be like, this is my temperature. This was the number I had in my head. I'm gonna sow 50,000 all at once. That's just impossible now, right? You have to, there has to be a snowball effect. You have to sow multiple seasons to get anywhere near that number. And the available soil, if nothing's been sown for a while, is like 100, right? Or 200.
Something around that range, yeah. Or they would submit an order to purchase soil at the morning auction. You know, we're in a point where demand for soil is high outside the morning auction, but we still haven't seen action in the auction yet. So I'm interested to see when that occurs. Like when there's when there's such a large queue that you just see no hope in getting your cells in, and you would rather just get a lower temperature. No, I find that very.
Wouldn't
eh, Sorry, what's
wouldn't
up?
you start increasing your tip first?
It depends on your size, I guess, right? Like if the tip requires like one and you have 100 pinch outs, then you would choose a 1% lower temperature. Uh, yeah, I think there is
But
some
it's
math
not
that like
1%, right? Yeah, there's got to be cutoff points because it's every 30 seconds. So like if you did 9 minutes, 30 seconds in, I think the lower temperature would exceed um, just raising your tip a little bit. It's interesting to see where the breakpoints are because it's a moving target, right? As the temperature changes, so too does that like tip versus lower temperature calculation.
yeah, the premise of the commentary on like the blocks. Right now the morning auction has 25 intervals, but in theory could have uh 150 intervals if you do it in every block. And with more intervals, we get more granular temperature changes. Perhaps 25 is just too big now for tractor, uh, such that someone would have sown in the morning auction had they were able to sell, like, let's say, an interval 24.5 or, something like that, but just couldn't due to the discrete nature of the morning auction. So
So
that's
is that
definitely
a
interesting.
plan or it's just a potential addition that depends on how this experiment goes in the next couple of weeks, whether it's worth doing or not.
Oh, truth be told, I just thought about it right now. I mean, this is an interesting idea. But yeah, I mean, the urgency to upgrade that, you know, is a function of how much utility Pinto will get from it. Now that I think about it, like it's always been in the plans to upgrade the morning option to like, make a curve and use it in a more continuous fashion. But there's just so many things to do on the farm that it was unclear. It was unclear on how this stacks in the totem pole. But you bring up a
So
great
how
point
was
on like
25 chosen? Sorry to
25
interrupt
was
you halfway through.
chosen. Not a problem. 25 was chosen because Beanstalk, which was launched on L1, had block times of 12 seconds. And originally, the morning auction was only 5 minutes. Uh, so with 25 intervals at 12 seconds per block, or I guess that's how we get the 25 interval. With 5 minutes and 12 seconds per block, you get 25 intervals. When we extended it to, and then when we migrated to L2, or sorry, when we like refactored the code to deploy on base blocks are 2 seconds instead of 25. And just to give you more context on why the intervals exist in the first place, you know, the formula of the morning auction uses a logarithm, and calculating the log on chain uh, was proven to be uh, gas expensive on L1. So it was opted to use these intervals, given that the values will be the same, given the high block times. Then when the choice to deploy on base was decided, we had two options, take the development effort to rewrite the code to use curve, increase the intervals, or sorry, yeah, increase the number of intervals, or just increase the time. And the lowest uh, work needed was the time one, where we just increased the time at each interval, given that there was just so much other things to do. Uh, so that was the choice, and creating and just linking the intervals. And at the time, we didn't think the cost of having less granularity would be that high. And
I think a
this is
more
where
ideal option. Sorry, go ahead.
no, I just wanted to say this is where we're at right now.
I think a more ideal option would be, rather than having like a really tight interval, you still have to pay the tractor operator, but you could potentially build in the soil order book like into the protocol itself, so that you have existing orders, and then the protocol fills those orders like in the exact temperature, um, ranking in which they were placed, and then you would have eliminate the kind of MEV market that we're creating with tractor operators. So that has lower cost for the user, and then also that your stuff is going to get executed because it's like a protocol level thing too. But that's a lot more engineering work.
Totally. I mean, yeah. I mean, we could talk about ideals, but it's hard. We have to justify it with the amount of work as well. A order book style enshrined protocol within Pinto would be amazing improvement on this current system. But there are so
Ford
much,
Pinto.
that is.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm good. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I was just going to ask Ford Pinto, can you restate how the protocol enshrined order book removes the front running opportunity?
Yeah. So if you have all the orders already like recorded by the protocol, then as the morning auction progresses and the temperature increases, um, like at each interval that it bumps up, it would see that there's already existing orders at certain temperature like marks, and it would be able to perfectly fill those orders as the temperature increased, if that makes sense. So there would not it would not be like a delayed thing, like, oh, whoever executes the tractor order faster gets in, but rather like the protocol steps up the temperature in the morning auction, and as the temperature steps up at certain intervals, it can see which orders would have hit basically between like the previous interval and the next interval, and then fill those orders as it steps up. That would require some kind of like um, something to trigger the execution of those transactions as the morning auction progresses. So almost like another sunrise call that happens perhaps multiple times. But you can still optimize it in such a way that like you could do just one call after the sunrise is over, and it would like fill all the orders that need to be filled like since the previous interaction with the protocol. But that's details.
Right, that makes sense. So it's like even if there was an order to submit a sow at interval 3, if the actual time at which the first transaction to sow in that season isn't submitted until a later interval, the protocol can basically enforce that whoever had that order to sow at interval 3 gets in first.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. I mean, yeah, I mean, like there are a number of ways to improve the field, like get better best for sure.
What else do people want to discuss?
Did you set up your tractor orders yet?
Coming soon,
Let's go.
but it seems like soil is selling out anyway, if I'm
Well,
following correctly.
all the more reason to get in faster. You want a higher temp.
Yeah, I was talking to someone and just passing by, and one of the things that will be interesting is the ability for people to update their tractor orders. Obviously we can't do that in like from a protocols perspective, but we could just cancel their current order and then make a new one, and then just manipulate the UI so as if like they're just changing an order. But I feel like having that ability would allow people to more or allow protocol to more finely tune or get a better sense of what the ideal temperature is. I feel personally, I feel like reducing friction in all degrees just helps us get more data on the model. And yeah, it seems like a huge friction in canceling the order and recreating it with slightly different parameters at the moment.
Yeah, that'd be cool. It's just a UI thing, but UI stuff is also work.
Yeah, I mean, I think UI stuff is hard. There's so much stuff, but nonetheless, very exciting. Like this is a new data stream, whole new data stream that we can look at and evaluate and see the snowball or the effect of PI6 finally.
Yeah, the 1% drop per season is pretty cool to see too. It doesn't seem to have had any effect on demand so far, which means that the market thinks the temperature is too high and is still willing to sow despite dropping 1% per season. So pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like the temperature was in a place where it wasn't high enough to overcome the friction, and now it's too high with no friction. Uh, from my perspective. I mean, like maybe just look at the UI and look at all the orders. Curious to see like the total amount of demand by the meaning of all the order size.
Yeah, I'm just
It
looking
looks
at that
like
now. It would be cool to split out, like you mentioned, have a line that indicates in the current soil orders, like where the current temperature is. And you could like draw a line there in the UI and sum up all the available Pinto that are able to be sown like at the current temperature, and then separately add up the amount that's ready to be sown like at higher temperatures. Would be quite useful.
yeah. Let's see, 1379. So it would be everything above this 1380 order. So right now we have around like 20,000, 30,000 impending soil orders. Find that very interesting.
Yeah, which is pretty good.
Pretty good.
It could be interesting to put a summation on this like view soil orders chart. I'm not sure if that was what you were just alluding to, but like, we sum up that at current season, there's say 25,000-ish Pinto that is like there's an open order to sow, right? And then that could be information that people look into to decide whether to join or whether it's worth it to wait, or to even just get an idea of where it's going to be in a couple. It would also be interesting to see, because we would know what the soil increases to every single season. So you would also be able to calculate like soils till like a projected soil seasons until soil sold out, or like until all of the orders are fully executed.
Yeah. I wish that we had an easy way to simulate that, but it would require a lot of manual calculation now. In theory, you could use something like Tenderly and like fork and then fast forward and like execute all of them, but that's also a lot of work to set up. But that would give you the most accurate view of like how things are projected to play out. But in theory, you can calculate that all as well anyway, just from the result of the sows. But maybe not exactly like if you're sowing from LP, then that also affects the price, which affects the soil availability. So a simulation really is the best way to play it out, I suppose.
I mean, even if it wasn't 100% accurate, it just gives you an idea of, current demand that's like already like quote unquote signed for. I mean, obviously people can go in and cancel their orders whenever they want, but at that point in time, it shows you, say plus or minus 5% of what season it'll sell out and how much is going to get sown.
Yeah.
Minor UI thing. This looks very pretty with like 20 order or 15 orders, 11, I don't know. Presumably if this grows to something like 5,000, do we have plans for this?
Great question. Yeah, it was unclear, how much activity there would be initially. And so there's no pagination anywhere, which scales extremely well.
Perfect.
And so, yeah, so the idea was add pagination when it's like absolutely necessary.
Soon.
That might be like end of day. Unless you use vertical monitors or something.
For which view specifically, like the view soil orders, because the next season
soil orders.
Yeah.
I mean, arguably we can take away the orders that have like 0 available Pinto.
Yeah, that's on my to-do list to like have a couple switches, like remove those with 0 available Pinto. Like, you might still want to see it. It's kind of interesting, like, just to know that an order is there, I guess. But also people might just not cancel the orders, and you can create an order to sow 1,000,000 Pinto with 0. There's no like limitations, so it's not really that big of an indicator, I suppose.
So you can make an order and then actually fill the wallet at a later time.
Yep. Yeah. And the idea behind that is that it will support like the conversion stuff in the future. So you might want to, sow, or you might want to convert only if Pinto like drops to a certain price, like then to buy Pinto. And then once you've bought, you might want to already sow it like at that point, because presumably that's also a good time to sow as well if the price has dropped. So it was made with that idea in mind. And anyway, it would be extremely difficult to like not allow people, like, you can create any blueprint you want, whether or not it's executable. So at an on-chain level, it's hard to enforce anything like that. So easier just to kind of filter stuff out at the UI level.
Yeah, makes sense. Excited to see the pagination in like 2 days.
Let's see.
I support Ford Pinto and his decision to only add pagination post-launch.
Hey, the later we launch, the higher the temperature grows. So we've already seen, I would say, a significant result from, even anticipation of the launch. I think people started sowing ahead of that. And so that has affected the temperature. So it was definitely important to get this out the door.
I'm honestly surprised how many people were withdrawing and selling over the last couple of weeks. Pretty cool. Free tractor.
Those
And
are the
post
true believers, right?
Yeah, and I was quite surprised the impact that shipping that atomic withdraw and so change in the UI had.
Oh yeah, that was pretty nice.
Yeah, I think that's the last UX you can kind of do UX improvement I've seen that's very obvious. I mean, I guess the other obvious one is like harvest and deposit, but that doesn't have as much of a benefit than withdrawal. And so I feel
Not at the moment, anyway. But it will.
soon.
Alrighty, folks, feel free to interrupt me if you have anything else you want to add. But since we're at the top of the hour, and I thought that was a fruitful discussion, I think we can wrap it up there.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks,
All right,
everybody.
thanks, crew. Peace.
Peace.